While everyone's coming up on stage, I'll introduce Patrick Pheasant, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the National ELT Accreditation Scheme, Niece and Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Hello, everyone. Are you almost ready for a drink? Yeah. I know our panel is what's standing between you and some,
I am.
Some people are. I know our panel's what's standing between you and the entertainment this evening, so I hope you enjoy the panel. And it's been a great honour, really, to be the chair of this panel, focusing on how do we measure quality and success with international students. We brainstormed some questions in our discussion for this panel, and we've heard a lot today from the various speakers about the importance of addressing the needs of international students. They bring a lot of revenue into our organisations, and they're certainly increasingly larger cohorts on our campuses. And yet we're challenged on trying to measure and understand what are the specific needs that international students have in our organisation. So I'm hoping you'll get a bit of a glimpse from our experts and hopefully walk away with some questions and hopefully some answers as well. We do invite you to ask questions through the app, and I may grab some of those questions as you ask them, and there's also time at the end of the panel as well for answering those questions too. But let me introduce the panel. So we have Brett Blacker, the CEO of English Australia. We have Professor Sophie Arkoudis, who is the Associate Director of Arkoudis.
I was going to give you the devil.
Thank you. All good. She's going to be the devil in our panel. More on the devil and angel later. So yes, Sophie Arkoudis, who's the Associate Director of the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education. We also have Bijay Sapkota, who's the President of the Council of International Students Australia, and we have Professor Chris Ziguras, who's the President of IEAA, the International Education Association of Australia. To keep you a little entertained throughout the panel, we're going to play a bit of a game as we go along. I have put underneath all of the panel members two pictures, a picture of a devil and a picture of an angel. So throughout the presentation, I may draw on the panel members to be the devil's advocate and respond to one of the other speakers, or to be the supporting angel and confirm or add some support statements to one of the other speakers. So if you see me raising those little characters, that's what it means. And I'd also invite you to be either the devil's advocate or the supporter with your questions as well. Okay, well, let's jump right into to ask Sophie Arkoudis some questions. Yes? Yeah. So, I mean, in your experience with the research that you've done, I'm really interested to hear how you would go about defining and measuring quality with regards to international students.
Sure, okay. It's a very difficult question, and I just want to start by saying that with our international student cohort, we're actually talking about very different students. They're very different cultural and linguistic experiences that they bring to studying in Australia, and we tend to sort of have an even playing field and say they're all international students and they have the similar characteristics. So the time that we've got allocated won't allow us to get through into some of the nuancing that needs to happen. So I'll start by saying that in higher education, particularly, we actually need to focus more on working out and having a stronger evidence base of the impact that we're having on international student learning. We actually don't know enough about that. And we don't know enough about that because we're not focusing enough on assessing students around what it is that they're learning, what it is that they need to learn, and where we'd like to take them with outcomes. And part of that difficulty is really around centred on academic staff and the teaching and learning practices that they adopt, and also part of the difficulty is around the practices that are used within universities. So can I just sort of talk a little bit about that? So I think, number one, if you've actually got recruiting international students, and universities are we've been very successful in increasing the number of international students that we're bringing to Australia, We also have to look at having some standards at points of entry into our courses. And there's great variety about, for example, what English language standards or minimum requirements we place in different sorts of courses that we're offering within universities. And that might be fine, but we know, for example, with IELTS scores that we need to have students with a minimum of 6.5, and then they need extra support while they're at university in order to be successful. But, you know, the reality is those numbers fluctuate up and down, and a whole lot of variety exists in that. So if we don't actually have standards on entry, it's very difficult to ensure quality on exit, because you're actually having to make up a lot of that ground. I think the other aspect that we really need to address in universities is when we're looking at the teaching and learning experiences of international students and what we're offering them and how we're making visible to them what the learning should be in the subjects that they're undertaking. And a lot of this rests with assessment, and it rests with trying to get better at assessing students for what they should be achieving and letting them know what that is, and also letting them know when they're not achieving and what it might take to actually get better with the quality of the work that they're producing. And this would also allow us to have more robust ways of defending our practices when it comes to issues of soft marking and all those types of allegations that sometimes get put out there with very little strong evidence base that they're actually existing. Have I got time for one more?
Yes, of course.
Okay, and the last one I think is that we're really hitting a critical phase with our international student markets, in the sense that there are lots of queries being placed around the quality of the educational experience that we're offering our international students. And some of these have to do with reports that are coming out of China, that students who are getting an Australian education and going back there are not actually being as employable as the students who stay there and are educated there. So I think while these sorts of ideas are milling around, and students do come to Australia for a variety of reasons, and one of those is to increase their educational experience and their employment opportunities, we need to take a firmer look at how we might be able to network more closely with community, with alumni, with industry, and integrate a little bit more of those employability skills that are required for students, for all our students actually, but particularly for international students, given limitations on their work experience, et cetera, to be able to allow them to foster those skills to make them more employable when they go back home.
Thanks, Sophie. So I'm hearing you're saying it's important to, I mean, international students are diverse, so it's not really a kind of a one-size-fits-all for kind of some of the solutions.
Yeah.
And it's also really important to consider the steps along the life cycle for the student, because, you know, there's different approaches at different stages there.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you. So over to Brett Blacker, CEO of English Australia. Now you represent a lot of English language colleges that sit in the higher education, university sector, as well as other sectors. And recently we've had, you know, changes to the ELICOS standards, which you've consulted on, and, you know, the ESOS Act. I'm interested to hear from your perspective, how do you measure and define success for international students?
Yep.
And also, well, what do you think the future has in store for us?
Okay, two big questions. I guess the first one, the definition of success and measurement, and with such a learned audience, I won't sort of try to go too technical. I think I'll leverage off Cody's definition in the past session from the regional session, where, you know, the broad definition of success being about the accomplishment of a set of aims or goals, and about the measurement just being an assessment of either the importance, the value, or indeed the effect of something. Now, if we look at that in terms of the lens, in an academic lens, then, you know, assessment is quite easily determined by a test and academic performance, or potentially extended out to the other key drivers which have been discussed here, I think numerous times today, around retention and progression. But if you look at that through the lens of a student, and as Sophie just mentioned, it's obviously much more complex, and I know Bijay will pick up on this as well. And so those attributes of why they're investing in their education, be it an international student or a domestic student, are far greater than just that academic progression. If you were to look at, I guess, Australia as a microcosm in international education, and if onshore international education was the measure of success, then Australia would by far be a higher distinction student. You know, if you look at the record numbers of enrolments and our global positioning, in 2016 to have some 544,000 students come to study here in Australia, and that was from 192 different nationalities, an enormous amount of diversity. When you look at that, and again, 11% growth, and even year to date, continues to grow at 11% overall and 15% within higher education. So quality and quality has to be part of that driver to why students are selecting to come to Australia, and the quality of their experience why they're here. Certainly academic quality is part of that. Some would argue that we've probably in the global context been an affordable quality, and as currency fluctuations change in different countries, you know, that starts to be challenged. And indeed, admissions requirements are another one of those proxies for quality, and in some of those key markets, and indeed China again, as there's increased competitiveness around entry requirements, that's another issue that we have to face as a risk. But I guess we have to look at, do international students' perceptions and requirements change to that of a domestic student? But I also look at it to the point of Bijay and as part of the panel today. If you look at that 554,000 people as part of Australia's population, broad terms, and we could argue the semantics, but broad terms, you're looking at about 1 in 45 people in Australia being an international student. If you look at it as part of the basic university, you start at a benchmark of 20% across a university. For my members, it's obviously 100%. English Language College is 100% international student. So if you look at the measurements of success, and indeed, you know, outside of that of enrolment, then tools that start to do that are tools where I guess you can have other metrics, but say the International Student Barometer and the Australian Student Satisfaction Survey. English Australia administer that on behalf of English language providers, and we're doing that survey at the moment, but it's a cross-sectoral survey. The last survey presented that overall 90%, or the feedback of students that were satisfied or very, very satisfied was 90%. And on the learning category alone, it was around 87%, a little bit higher for English language. So looking at that metrics, I think there are some indicators that we can draw upon outside of the legislative framework, which would say Australia's scorecard is doing quite well, albeit with a number of risks. Where do we go from here, Patrick? Just to, I guess in brief terms. At the moment, we're sort of concluding the process of the sort of, well, you mentioned the Accreditation national standards, and that's kind of one of the last elements of the legislative framework, which has been under review. And ESOS, our Education Service for Overseas Students Act, which I think has been a paramount of Australia's success, is probably seen globally as one of the best quality assurance frameworks, as a student protection framework. But that came in back, or was last reviewed in 2015. It came into effect, so it's kind of like painting the harbour bridge. And I think by the time we get the foundation program standards done next year, we'll be back to doing the review again. There was a lot of good things, good elements, but even when we look at, particularly in ELICOS, you know, there's new standards in there around assessment, and I confirm that's assessment, not test, of how providers, particularly in these direct entry pathways that don't use IELTS, or standardised testing, how they assure the quality or the validity of the students going into the pathway degree. Now, where I see that is probably picking up on Professor Saunders' comment this morning, the growth most likely or ultimately going to happen within the private higher education setting. And I think that the partnership between private higher education and traditional higher education needs to be at the forefront of that. I know we recently launched a direct entry program special interest group, and it was really interesting that we had great and enthused participation or expressions of interest to be part of that group. But it was a number of our non-university providers actually wrote to us to see whether they were accessible, if it was accessible. And it was kind of like a non-sense of entitlement, whereas we want that to be more inclusive. So I think that public-private partnership has to be part of that next wave of how we look at quality controls and success.
Yeah, some good points. I mean, and I would certainly echo that, Australian standards are famous worldwide. A lot of the work that my organisation does is to quality assure by Australian standards, and there's certainly a large interest in using those standards. Let's look at, from a student perspective, with Bijay's comments. So Bijay, you were New South Wales International Student of the Year in 2016, yep. And you've been involved with a lot of committees and activities engaging with senior leadership at universities as a student and representing international students. I'm really interested to hear from you what you believe students think is quality and success from the student perspective.
It's a very vague question. As Brett mentioned before, quality and success, it's a very, and since international students is it's such a big cohort, it would be quite hard for me to answer the question on behalf of all the students, but at the same time I'll try my level best so that I don't piss off my fellow international students right here. Quality means better education, better engagement, better advice, and better direction. Quality would be a tool, but success would be the result of that tool. So for international students, if they get better education, if they're better engaged, and if they get better direction, better advice on where they are heading to, then they would certainly achieve success in terms of getting either employed or either being an entrepreneur or either stepping into leadership, either back in the hometown, home place, or in Australia. I'd like to add furthermore comments in the upcoming questions about what international students would love to see in Australia in terms of engagement, in terms of jobs, and in terms of liaising with community as well. Yeah.
So I'm very interested to hear from your perspective. I think a lot of the solutions that are provided to, enhancing the international student experience and to encouraging them to do well and really looking at supporting international students uses a deficit model where we go in and we try to fix the problems of the international students rather than looking at the bigger picture and how the support from domestic students and from embedding into the curriculum support for international students, especially around English language. I'm interested to hear from you what you think about that. I mean, what's your experience as a student?
So I'd love to make a comment on international students, some of the struggles they go through in terms of job security when we talk about success. Let's say there's an engineering student who wants to do a part-time job first to get experience in hand to work as an engineer later on. They do have the work entitlement of 20 hours per week. Majority of the job vacancies, they do have 25 hours minimum requirement. How do we expect an international student to be successful in the terms of with no prior experience in the student life? The other issues would be around international students' engagement in university or institutions' governance. I'm glad we are joined in by Professor Sally Varnum here. She's been advocating for international students' engagement in university governance since, as Brett already mentioned, international students represent about 1 out of 4 or 5 people residing in Australia. So international students are really underrepresented in university governance, in institutional governance, or in the decision-making places. And it is very important for us to think about how do we bridge this gap and how do these international students engage. I was one of those lucky international students who got to engage with many peers, many stakeholders, and I'm staying here. But there are numerous international students who do not even know about the importance of academic boards, or who do not even know if there is a faculty board in existence in their university. Actually, in order to bridge this gap, we as CISA, we have initiated and we are working in collaboration with 4 national peak bodies, CAPA, NUS, NATSIPA, and we're planning on signing an MOU to work collaboratively on common student issues so that we could bridge the gap in terms of issues that international and domestic students face in common. The other aspect would be proper academic advice. International students, they do not have proper English. When I came to Australia, I didn't have proper English as well. Started off from UTS in search. I can see Associate Professor Sally Payne here. Okay. So yeah, when I came to Australia, my English was really bad. Okay, I didn't know what I was studying. I didn't go through the university handbook, everything we have. But I have to quote UTS in search again. UTS in search had an academic advisor. So I went to all the academic advisors, talked to them, and they gave me proper directions. So one thing we should be looking at when we talk about international students is they come here with not that better English proficiency. At that time, they would need people who would assist them to guide them through. I can give an example of one of my friend who was doing mechatronics engineering. And he was very frustrated. I was in the university council, and he came up to me and asked me whether I could assist him in giving him proper direction on where he's heading to. What he told me was he joined mechatronics engineering with an expectation of, inventing robots or playing with robots, modern devices. But when he started his course, all he had to do was to engage with DOS programming, black and white computer, and working with DOS programming. He was so frustrated. So I think international students, they, before coming to Australia, they do not reach, majority of the international students don't get the opportunity, and they do not have that level of English proficiency to read through the contents of what's in the course. Now, when they come through pathways like English course, or if they come through diploma, foundation, that is where these international students can be given proper direction in terms of what their course actually is. And this is something I struggled with as well. So, yep, would love to add more.
So we're talking about the life cycle and your experience at the beginning of that journey. You also mentioned when we were talking before about the experience at the end of the journey with job security and trying to get work. Can you share a little bit about that as well?
As I mentioned before, international students, they have 20 hours work limitation as part-time, when they study, right? And in order to get a job, for example, for me as an engineer, if I want to get a job in engineering related field, then I couldn't get an engineering job and compete with other students who would have engineering related experiences, and myself getting experience from 7-Eleven or something. How could I expect to compete, right? And when we talk about quality and success, now this is where it varies, and this is very, very critical when we talk about international students being able to get that experience, even if they go back to their country or stay here. They have to be, I think Australian education system is fantastic, but at the same time, we have to be very careful in terms of whether that quality and that success is being achieved by international students. That's number one. The second thing is, in terms of international students, when they go out there, the community is not aware. First thing we need to be looking at is to make the community aware of what is the importance of international students. What do they bring to the community? And this has been brought up a couple of times in today's panel discussions. So it's very important to educate business stakeholders, and also the community at large, to educate them on what international students bring with them if they get recruited. So it is very important. And also it is very important to bridge the gap between domestic and international students. Having said this, I'm not trying to say that we should get more jobs than domestic students, but there should be a fair go with the same course where domestic students study and international students.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for sharing your experience there. Okay, we've got some questions coming up, but I'd like to just turn first to Professor Chris Ziguras. You've had a lot of experience engaging with the various metrics and surveys and data sets that are out there measuring all sorts of elements about this international student experience. Can you share some of your insight from that data? How does the data help us understand really how students perceive quality and success?
Sure. Great. Thanks, Patrick. And look, the International Education Association at the moment is embarking on a project to look at data gaps in international education broadly. And so I thought, when faced with this challenge, this panel, what the students think about quality, I thought of dig into the data to find out how would we know based on the data that we have. And in Australia, we actually have really good data compared with most higher education systems in lots of ways. And so as a researcher, which is part of what I do, it's a joy to work in the Australian system compared with some others sometimes, looking at equivalent things. And so the project at the moment, if anyone's interested in data issues in international education, if you Google IEAA data gaps, you'll find a survey. We're asking people who work in the sector, what sort of data do you need to access? Is there any data that you would like that you can't access, or any deficiencies? So we're at that stage of doing a survey now of people's use of data and their desires for extra data. And then through February, we're doing consultations around the country with groups who are using data in various ways. And so if you do that survey, and you're interested in consultations, we can follow up in February. But look, firstly, there's a couple of different data sets I want to talk about. One is a very large international student survey that's done in Australia every 2 years, and we've been doing it since 2010. And that uses an external tool developed first in the UK called the International Student Barometer. And so we survey over 50,000 students every 2 years in all sorts of institutions. So last time in 2016, there was 66,000 responses to the survey. So 26% of response rate, which is pretty good for an online survey. And that survey is really interesting for us because it compares our students with a pool of 3 million students who've filled in this survey around the world over a decade. And so we can get interesting comparisons between Australian outcomes and outcomes of international students to many other countries. But importantly, at an institutional level, that allows the institutions to see how their international students, disaggregated by college, by program and so on, compare with students nationally and internationally. And that survey has been supported by the Commonwealth Department of Education and Training for quite a few years now, which I think is a fantastic intervention by the government, because what it does is provides data back into many layers down within higher education institutions, which shapes behaviour of institutions and it shapes incentives, because lots of people's careers are held to account based on that sort of data that's provided internally. So that's been really informative, that sort of data. Having said that, there's a couple of limitations, I think, and one is that on a national scale, the reporting of it is fairly thin. So there's a one-page infographic on higher education students, tens of thousands of them, and the results are great. It shows that, as Brett said before, 90% of international students in Australia are overall satisfied, 87% with the quality of their learning and so on, and that's either at par or better than students globally. So we know, if you look at the millions of students who are travelling overseas around the world, we're performing on par with other countries. So that's good. But we don't publish similar breakdowns of that data as we do in other sets. So we can't get any demographic breakdown by the types of students coming in. We can't tell by level of study, by field of study, and so on. And at a national level, we should be able to have that sort of data to be able to have a conversation with peak bodies and others about how we're faring in providing services to students. So within institutions, the data is very fine-grained, which is great and needs to be. What we report outside, we don't want to identify individual institutions and students, but I think it could be much more detailed than we have. One other limitation of that data is that there's been underrepresentation of non-university higher education providers and vocational education in the past. And so now we're working on that. The International Education Association is recruiting those institutions to participate. And the Commonwealth Department of Education subsidises participation in this survey. So they'll pay half of the cost of the survey. And for small providers with less than 50 international students, the whole cost is funded by the Commonwealth of that survey. So if any providers here haven't been involved in that survey before, I strongly encourage you to do it. It provides great data back to the institution, and you can contact the IAA Secretariat who can help. One other gap there is with offshore students. And so offshore students in the past haven't been included in that survey. But now iGraduate is also administering an offshore version of that survey next year, again with support from the Commonwealth Education Department, which is fantastic. So those two areas have been underrepresented, small providers and offshore students are going to be included from next year, which is fantastic. The other big data set that we have is the QUILT indicators, quality indicators in learning and teaching. And their international students in Australia are surveyed along with other students, which is great. But what they show is that student satisfaction of international students and students from non-English speaking backgrounds overall, domestic students and international, have low rates of satisfaction than domestic students or native English speakers. It's around 81% compared with 75%. So that's concerning there. And it's particularly on learner engagement and teaching quality. Perceptions there of international students are lower than others. So that's something that we've got to look more at. I think we've got to spend more time digging into that data. And in what's published on the QUILT by the agencies involved, it's difficult to dig down into why that is, but I think we need to get better outcomes or better understandings there. And again, transnational students aren't included in that data. So we don't have any indication through QUILT about how we're delivering quality education to the 100,000 plus students who study in our higher education system outside Australia. So we neglect those students in many different types of data collection. Similarly, the graduate outcomes survey that's part of that includes international students onshore, but it doesn't report on domestic versus international students. So we can't tell about the employment outcomes. All we can tell from what's reported is by English language spoken at home and a language other than English spoken at home. And there we know that the employment outcomes are poorer for students from non-English speaking backgrounds, and I think that's been understood and been the case for a long time, and it's quite intractable, unfortunately. But what's interesting in the new survey there that's been added is an employer perception survey, and the employer perceptions of students who they're employing from non-English speaking backgrounds is actually better than native English speakers, which I've found fascinating. But again, in that data, the way we report it, it doesn't give us any breakdowns of international versus domestic students. Neither do those graduate outcomes surveys include offshore students in the reporting. So some institutions might choose to administer those surveys to offshore students, which I think they should, and they will have that data internally to be able to compare how their students are travelling offshore in Australia. But in the national conversation about how we talk about how we're serving our students, we completely neglect that quarter of international students who are studying in their home countries or somewhere else. And I think it's those students who we really need to include within that sort of data collection. Yes, so maybe I'll finish there, but that's my sense.
You know, it's really interesting to hear how the data sets kind of match the experience we have here, as Bijay's indicated. We've got some questions that have come up, and I'm going to throw the first one to Sophie, and Sophie's going to be devil's advocate on this one. So Sophie, as the devil's advocate, not necessarily your personal view, but you can just go for it. Just the devil's view. How would you best support study abroad students who just come over for study for one term?
I was hoping you were going to ask me questions. I was looking at the others. How would I support? Well, first of all, I'd like to get rid of the word support totally out of our nomenclature that we use around international students, because it feeds into the deficit views that you talked about, that they need support in some way. And I think we need to come up with some other language to talk about this. And secondly, if they're here for a term, I'll just revert back to my applied linguistics background. You give them an immersion program, you get them out there socialising, speaking English every opportunity they can get, because we can't underestimate the value of developing social language skills that facilitate the development of academic language skills. They go hand in hand. That's what I would be doing, socialising them as much as possible with English speakers.
And I guess that kind of fits into another question, which is really talking about the holistic university experience, not just what happens in the classroom, but all of the student engagement and student experience activities around the classroom. Being an angel, please, Bijay, with regards to student experience, what's been some best practice you've seen for activities outside of the classroom?
In terms of universities, now there are pros and cons to this. Like majority of the universities or institutions in Australia, they do have clubs, societies, different student bodies. But at the same time, international students are really underrepresented, as I mentioned before, in universities board as a whole. So like when we talk about university council, we cannot expect, there's a country, I can't anecdote the name, but there's a country which has a women's council which is made of all male. It's the similar case with international students. How can you expect a university council or university boards with no international students in there? How can we get their opinions on board? Can we talk on their behalf? No, we cannot. In CISA, we had the same issue. This time, it wasn't because of our choice. What happened was none of the women, CISA women, ran for election, but we had CISA members who were women. And we couldn't say that, okay, we are men, and I actually have been advocating personally for women empowerment for a long time, for more than 3 years. I couldn't even say that, okay, I would speak on behalf of the women. We had to amend the constitution, elect a women's officer on board to speak for the women. So it is very important that students are engaged. And when we talk about statistics, and you know, when there is statistics based on entire student experience, international students who are not engaged do not fill in statistics. In my first 2 years, or 1.5 years of my university, I never filled out any survey, nor did my friends. So international students have to be encouraged to engage in university governance. People like Sally Varnum, her symposium, you know, we have to give her a higher stake in terms of like giving her the priority on doing the research in this area and what international students can bring to the community. There's a fantastic thing that happened in UTS Aerial Function Center a couple of months ago in Sally Varnum's symposium. She had all the 4 student leaders on board. We had Sadie, Peter, and Sophie. So all these peak bodies, I was very delighted to meet all of them, and I could see majority of the international student issues relate to domestic student issues. But you know, we are not even able to communicate with each other because international students are so less represented. Today's TEXA conference as well, I would just like to ask if there can international students raise your hand? I'd just like to have a look. How many of us are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Brett, I think I gave you a fine number. So certainly it is such a great conference, and it's such a great place to get international students know about what's going on in terms of quality of education of Australia. Australia has so much to offer, but we do not have them engaged. When we restrict that borderline, and it's not that international students cannot participate in engagement or cannot engage themselves in governance, or there's no restriction. But the fact that international students have to be encouraged in the orientation, probably when they come to the university, they have to be encouraged about, okay, these are the areas where we can engage in governance.
Yeah, no, thank you for your comments on that, and thank you for the questions from the audience. And I'd like to thank the panel members. Thank you. Can you give a round of applause to the panel members? Sophie, Bijay, and Chris.
And thank you to you.
Yep.